I would say those are the main frames that I would use for endurance training: pyramidal distribution, polarized distribution, and which one you use in what sequence will be determined by what you need and when is your next competition and what is your next competition.
You've spoken about building the base broad and then peaking towards competition. Are there any other considerations when you're deciding the blend of the zones that you're prescribing to somebody?
There's an idea in endurance training called intensity distribution. So it's what proportion of your training is at low, medium, high, or very high intensity. And the two big ones, and I think they're the two most relevant ones for most people, are polarized and pyramidal training. So polarized just means that you have a high proportion of your training that's done at low intensity and another part at high intensity and very little in the middle. So very little medium intensity work, mostly low and high intensity, right? That's polarized training. And then the pyramidal work is a strong base of low intensity. That's constant in endurance. And then a piece of the work at medium intensity, but very little at high intensity. Right? And for me, those are the foundations of endurance programming, meaning there's phases of time where we're going to be in the more pyramidal approach. The low intensity is like the constant. It always stays there to some extent. Obviously, at certain times of the year, if you're peaking for a non-endurance sport, you can put that volume aside. You can reallocate that volume, that training load to other things that are more important, but you can't get away from that forever. You're going to have to go back to it and rebuild the base at some point. But if you're in an endurance sport, low intensity is a constant in the program. It's always the foundation because it's just going to allow you to develop what we talked about before, the mitochondria, the capillaries, and the slow twitch fibers, which are the foundation of your metabolism and of your conditioning, right? So that's the constant. And then you're just going to bounce back and forth between more medium intensity training or more high intensity training, depending on the phase, pyramidal or polarized, based on your needs. So very concrete example, if you're prepping for a 5K run, which is typically going to be at high intensity, right? Far away from competition, you would use a more pyramidal approach with low and medium intensity training to build that base. So you would do your zone 2 training, you would do your tempo moving up into threshold over time. And then when you start nearing the competition, maybe 10 weeks out, 8 weeks out, 12 weeks out, depends on the person, depends on many things. We would switch to a more pyramidal approach and a more polarized approach. And now your medium intensity, the 2 sessions that you allocated each week to that development, they're going to move up at high intensity and they're going to start going towards your race pace, right? And that's another distinction we can make is the general phase is we're going to be thinking about those intensity domains, about low intensity, medium intensity, high intensity. We're going to think about thresholds. We're going to think about kind of that raw foundation of physiology. But in the specific phase, we're going to think about race pace, right? Yeah. Because now we're shifting focus from building the physiology to actually performing in the sport, right? If the race was won with your thresholds, then we'd all go to the lab, get tested, and whoever has the biggest one wins, right? Mm-hmm. That's not how it works. So at some point you have to shift and actually train for the sport, right? We made that mistake at the beginning of the year with Claudia, where we did 3 months of very general training for her, meaning only one CrossFit session a week, and all the rest was dedicated to building her running capacity, building her strength, posterior chain, because those are her limiting factors in general in CrossFit. And then towards Wodapalooza, we shifted towards CrossFit again. But she hadn't done CrossFit since the game. So it was 4 months without any CrossFit virtually. And we had, she got sick in there for a week. So we had a total of maybe 7-8 weeks of CrossFit leading into Wodapalooza. And what she felt is that she wasn't ready for that big a competition with that amount of time. So next year, we know that the first time she goes back to competition, we probably need 2 to 3 weeks more of pure CrossFit in that specific phase before the competition, so that she feels better. Now, obviously, she's done this. Then we did another little general phase, but then we quickly went back into a specific phase because there was mayhem, and then there was the French throwdown, so there was no time in between to do any general stuff. Now we're in the season, we're full specific. Now she's taking 2 weeks off, and then we're starting again, going pretty quickly into specifics again, because then it's the games, right? Mm-hmm. So for her, there's 3 months out of the year where she's really in the general phase, where she really doesn't do much CrossFit. where we build all the stuff that she needs to then be able to perform at the best level in CrossFit. And so that, I would say those are the main frames that I would use for endurance training: pyramidal distribution, polarized distribution, and which one you use in what sequence will be determined by what you need and when is your next competition and what is your next competition, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And how would you adjust that? I know you've done a lot of work with MMA fighters as well. When you're preparing somebody for something that could be over in a minute, or it could be 25 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Very good question. I would always plan for the worst case scenario or the longest case scenario. So the MMA fighters, we know that their stuff is high intensity and it's very demanding, if for nothing else than the psychological component. So they need to be ready to just give their life for 25 minutes, right? 25 is pretty long, right? And so the more capacity you can build behind that before going into the hard stuff, the better they'll be. And I know how hard it is in combat sports with shifting calendars, dates coming up really quickly, having to be ready from one day to the next. So you always have to keep a thread of that high intensity, I would say, to not be completely away from it for too long a time in case something just drops and in 3 weeks you have to be ready, right? But I would still allocate as much time as possible in the season doing the low and medium intensity, because you know that the camp is going to be high intensity. You know that the sport is high intensity in nature and very demanding on the body. So fitting in as much as the base as you can, so that when you do the hard stuff, you can do more of it, you can recover faster, and you can last longer.
Got it. Got it. And this probably covers both CrossFit and MMA. When you get to that high specificity phase going into competition, are you thinking about work to rest in the same way? Like, would you do 5-minute sparring sessions, then half that time to rest if you're like thinking about going 4, or is it all?
Good question. That's a good question. So since we've kind of gone away now from, because we're in this specific phase, if we call it like that, so we're just thinking about the sport. I'm not thinking about VO2 max anymore.
Okay.
VO2 max was in the physiological development phase, which is not the sport, right? So the work to rest ratio, I would think about in the phase where we're trying to develop those qualities. But once we're shifted onto the sport, now is what do we need for the sport? And if you need to be good for 5 minutes and then recover in 1, then train that. But it's almost going to be more about habituation, getting the athlete ready for that type of frame, so that it's not completely new when they get to the competition and they've done it over and over again. That's also how the body and the mind adapt, right? Same as take an example of a cycling race, right? If all you've done to prepare is threshold intervals, tempo intervals, and VO2 intervals at constant intensity, but now you start a race and it starts out fast and people start sprinting in the first 2 minutes, guess how your race is going to go? Not so well, right? So once you get into the specific phase, and for those who are interested in endurance sports or endurance concepts in general, there's a really good YouTube channel, a guy called Dylan Johnson. He rides in gravel racing, and he's very open about his training and what he does, and it's super interesting. And he talks about how he prepares specifically for those long 3 to 4 hour races that he does. The specific sessions are going to include 20 minutes really hard at the beginning, then a bunch of work, then a bunch of intervals, and then at the end, another 20 minutes super hard, right? Whereas in a typical session, you would do your warm up, you would start easy, and then you would do your sets, and then you would cool down on the back end. Well, in an actual race, it's the opposite, because where you are in the field is going to dictate to a high degree if you can keep up with the guys in the front or not. And if you can't get to the front in the first 20 minutes by pushing crazy power, you're never going to win or even get a chance to be in the conversation. So you need that 20 minutes at the beginning, and you need the 20 at the end to finish strong, right? And you need a bunch of stuff in the middle, depending on terrain, depending on your competition and everything. So really being able to shift between, I want to build the physiology, I want to build the foundation, and then shifting to what is the sport requiring me to do, and then just becoming elite at the sport itself and the competition itself, and not just be a master in training physiology, but then losing the plot when it comes to the race.
Yeah, that's super cool. And I think for the MMA thing, the other side of it, a fight, is that you can also dictate the pace. So if you are a bit gassed, you can slow things down. You have that option. Whereas in endurance sport race, other people dictate the pace to some extent.
Yeah,
So you have to be
that's
ready for what they put on you.